Yep, you can guess it. We're back in the story of Joseph. But you know what comes first? It's time to recap.
Let's recap.
Recap.
Right, I've so been enjoying this story, and I hope that you guys too. So let's just recap over what we've already learned in the last 2 weeks. So first of all, we all know that Joseph had dreams, and he told his family all about the dreams and that they were going to serve him one day or bow down to him one day, and his brothers didn't like that, so they tried to murder him. But they didn't murder him, they sold him. And so basically what they tried to do is that they tried to get rid of the dreamer, but instead of getting rid of the dreamer, they actually started to fulfill God's dreams. Isn't that amazing? Because God is sovereign, remember? All right. So then he gets sold to Potiphar, and Potiphar is in Egypt, and he's a very important man. So Joseph starts working there, and he doesn't grumble, he doesn't moan, but he is faithful. And because he's faithful to God in all that he does, and he starts serving God, so he starts serving Potiphar, and so God blesses Joseph and then all that he does for Potiphar. And he finds good favor in Potiphar's eyes. But then one day, Potiphar's wife, she starts to tempt him. That's not so cool. And instead of being led into temptation or giving into temptation, Joseph fled. So remember last week we learned about temptation, and that sometimes we'll be enticed, or we'll be really wanting to join in the crowd, and we'll be tempted to do things that we know that is not Christ-like. But we must flee, all right? And so we've learned that God is sovereign. God keeps his promises, and that Joseph doesn't grumble when he's in hardships like we sometimes find ourselves in, so that we must serve like Joseph did, and that we must flee from temptation. Wow, Joseph really was a righteous guy. So my question is, are you also a righteous kid? Right, let's go back to now, and let's join Joseph while he's now.
Help! Let me out of here! Gotcha!
Oh my word! Charlie in jail! My heart! I'm so glad he's not really in jail. But we do find that Joseph is in jail now, and for doing the right thing. Can you believe it? But he is a good guy. He's a righteous guy, and he doesn't grumble, but he does the next right thing. And he continues to serve God faithfully while he's in jail. And he finds favor with the jailer, and the jailer puts him in charge of all the other prisoners. Now, sometime after he's been put in jail, there are two men who do an offense against the king, and they find themselves in jail. A cupbearer.
There you go, Mom.
Oh, why? Thank you, Charlie. And a baker.
There you go, Mom.
Oh, brownies. Robin, thank you. You're such a good baker. Anyway, so they land up in jail because they did an offense to the king, and while they're there, one night they have a dream. Okay, and they are a bit perplexed. They wake up in the morning and they are very sad, and Joseph can see that they're not themselves. So he asks him, he says, what's wrong? And well, what we can do now is let's all turn to Genesis 40, verses 5 to 8. Genesis 40, verse 5 to 8, and let's read together.
Genesis 40, verse 5 to 8. Each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw they were dejected. So he asked the Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in the master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there was no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams."
All right, so in these verses, you can see that the men share with Joseph that they had these dreams and they are troubled. And Joseph says that his God can interpret dreams. I just want you to take a moment. Don't you think that's amazing? He could have easily said, I can interpret your dreams, or let me interpret your dreams, but he doesn't. Let's read again in verse 8. The second part of verse 8, it says, Then Joseph said to them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. And there again, he then like draws their attention to God. Okay, isn't that amazing? Do you do that with your friends? Draw their attention to God. He doesn't take any glory for himself, but again, he humbly directs their attention to God. And he says, only God can interpret dreams. I think that's a lesson for us all to learn. All right, so if we want to go through and then listen to their dreams, I want you to go and read by yourselves verse 9 to 19, chapter 49 to 19. Okay, but to save time, I'm going to explain that the cupbearer and the baker have these dreams, and then Joseph, through God's willingness, and he lets Joseph interpret these dreams. He lets him know what they're all about, and Joseph then tells him that the cupbearer is going to be reinstated to his position alongside the king, and that he is going to be taken out of jail, and then he's going to get his job back. But the baker, unfortunately, he says it's not going to be so good. He's going to be let out of jail, but unfortunately he's going to be hanged. And sure enough, in 3 days' time, I think it was the king's birthday, these two men get released, and the cupbearer is reinstated to his position, but the baker is hanged. But knowing that the cupbearer was going to be released and have his position back, Joseph says to him, listen, when you get out there, please ask the king to remember me. Ask him and just speak favor of me, please. But you know what happens? The cupbearer forgets all about him. And he forgets about him for about 2 years. Now, can you imagine being Joseph? You were sold, you're in Potiphar's house, you were in charge of everything, and then next thing, from doing good for fleeing, he then landed up in jail for thinking the king thought he did something wrong, but it was actually the right thing, and now he's stuck in there and forgotten in there. But all the while did not grumble, but served God faithfully and served the jailer faithfully, because he honors God. All right, so 2 years goes by, and then one night the king has a dream. Okay, and let's read from Genesis 41 verse 14 all the way to 32. Okay, so let's read together.
Hello everyone, today I'm going to be reading from Genesis chapter 41 verse 14 to 24. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. I've heard it is said of you that you can hear a dream and you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, It is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all of the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still ugly as in the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on a stalk, full and good, 7 ears withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind sprouted after them. And then the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me.
Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. Then 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. There are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will rage through the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because of the famine that follows. It will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon.
Right, so through these verses, we can now see that Joseph was remembered 2 years later when the king had dreams, and the cupbearer finally remembers, oh, there was this Hebrew who interpreted my dreams, so maybe he can interpret yours, because all the other men around the king couldn't do so. So was this a coincidence? I think not. I think God had a very much planned idea here. Okay, so let's continue to see what God's plan was. So Joseph is pulled before the king, and the king then tells him his dreams, and Joseph then says, my God can interpret dreams. Again, he just keeps going back to God. Isn't that amazing? All right, and he says, King, your dreams means that there are going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of lean, which means that there's going to be a famine. Okay, there's going to be a drought. There's not going to be much food. And so he says to the Pharaoh, because you had the dreams twice, it means that these things God is going to make happen. All right, so then Pharaoh is so impressed by this, but not only by this, because once Joseph had interpreted the dreams, he then suggests to him, then why don't you find a man who is worthy of a job that knows how to manage these years of plenty and then the years of famine. And he puts forward a proposal of how you should manage these years. And the king is so impressed by Joseph's interpretations and his way of planning the 7 years or the 14 years altogether, that he then reinstates him again, but as vice president. And he says, you have control over everything. The only thing you don't have control over is the throne. Okay, so he becomes vice president. God is definitely at work here, don't you think? Okay, so 7 years of plenty come, and 7 years of storing up grain and making wise decisions come, and then the 7 years of famine come, and the people start to get hungry. But I want us to just stop here for a moment, and I want us to read Psalm 105 verses 16 and 17. Let's read this together.
He called for a famine on the land of Canaan, cutting off its food supply. Then he sent someone to Egypt ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with fetters and placed his neck in an iron collar. Until the time came to fulfill his dreams, the Lord tested Joseph's character.
Guys, don't you think this is amazing that these verses shows God's sovereignty? In verse 1 of Psalm 105, it says, give thanks to the Lord, call on his name, make known among the nations what he has done. And then again in verse 16 and 17, you can see there that the famine was planned, that God planned for Joseph to go ahead. Isn't that incredible? And that's such a deep joy, knowing that when we are facing things that we don't understand in our lives, like even this COVID-19 thing, we don't understand why we can't go and play with friends, why we can't go on holiday, why we have to be stuck at home, and we don't understand all these things. We might not even be able to see it, but we do know that God ordains everything. He ordained, he allowed, or he planned for this famine to happen. He planned for the 400 years of Israelites being in Egypt, okay, before he sends them. And same here in verses 16 and 17. He called down famine on the land and destroyed all their supplies of food, and he sent a man before them, Joseph, sold as a slave. That is completely planned by God. Isn't that incredible how we can trust him and just know him, that everything is in his hands? All right, so let's carry on. So we can start to see here God's plan being fulfilled, how the brothers sold him. Did that just happen by chance? Did that happen because there's sin in the world? No, because God planned it that way. And we can see that now, the fulfillment of God's seed spending 400 years in Egypt. Because Joseph is in Egypt, Now his family, we'll see in the next chapters, are going to come to Egypt. And this is how the Israelites start to land up in Egypt. And this is all ordained. This is all planned by God. And he is sovereign. And I was watching John Piper, and he said, we cannot resist God's ultimate purposes. We cannot stop what God has planned, because he is a good God, and his plans are sovereign, and they're for his glory. So even if it looks like disaster after disaster is happening for Joseph, it is not. He knew that his people were going to land up in Egypt. He knew he needed someone to save them. So he has sent Joseph ahead to do all of this so he can be the start of his people being saved. Okay, guys, hope you can take that with you this week. Remember, God is sovereign. God keeps his promises always. Okay, stay away from temptation. Just recap from last week. But just know deep down in your heart that you can have joy, because God's ultimate purposes always come to fruition. They always come to plan, because he loves us and he wants to save us.